Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on the impact of changing merger control thresholds on the startup ecosystem in India. My name is Nishant, Chadha, and I am head of research at the Center for the Digital Future. And as a part of what I do, I also coordinate this initiative on choice, competition, and innovation. This was an initiative we launched last year. With the idea of conducting research and disseminating research and knowledge broadly in the areas of competition economics and competition law, specifically as it pertains to the digital economy. And so the project has initial financial support from Facebook. It is a collaborative effort. We are actively seeking, partnerships with researchers, organizations, and others working in this field with the sole purpose of being able to shed light on some of the complex issues that arise in this area. Before I introduce the session for today very quickly, I just wanted to, I have a few housekeeping announcements. So we are recording this session and, we'll make it publicly available. If you have any questions, and I encourage you, if you have any questions, please do ask them, put them in the Q&A box. I'm going to try and develop this discussion organically. So I'll pose the questions to the panel members, and I'll try and weave any questions that you have during the discussion. So please, once again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. I am not going to introduce all the participants at the same time. I will introduce each of you as I bring you into the discussion. So let me quickly introduce the topic for today. As most of you may be aware, the Competition Law Amendment Bill is listed for discussion in the current session of the Parliament. It actually started, the process for this started a couple of years ago with the Competition Law Review Committee. And one of the things amongst others that the committee focused on was this issue of combinations, and especially the issue of combinations in the digital economy. And the feeling was that the current thresholds that we have for notification of mergers are perhaps inadequate for the digital markets. And these thresholds currently rely on either asset holdings or revenues of the two parties. And, we can discuss whether that is, correct, how correct that is, maybe that if that comes up during the discussion, but that was what the review committee said. And then perhaps based on that, the current the version that we have for the Competition Amendment Bill proposes changes in the regulation of combinations, allowing the central government in public interest and in consultation with the CCI to prescribe any criteria in addition to those already specified in the Act. And there are three, I think, features that I wanted to bring out before we start the discussion. The first thing I wanted to point out was that there is an obligatory standstill period of now of 150 days, reduced from 220 in the bill, in the amendment bill, meaning that no merger can come into effect in that 150-day period, if it is to be notified to the Commission. The second, the other two sort of maybe facts that I wanted to point out was that, again, we all know India has an active startup ecosystem, has a very active startup ecosystem, and something that we are trying to grow as in our ambitions to become a bigger and stronger digital economy. And acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions continue to be a significant route for exit for these startups. And typically when we think about this question, we think about acquisitions because we're thinking of the relationship between big tech companies and startups, and acquisitions as a way of exit. But there's something else going on too. We have very fractured markets, as you typically expect when you start a new market. Digital markets in a lot of areas, if you think about edtech, if you think about local language, social media, they're also very fragmented at the moment. And acquisitions are also an inorganic way of actually consolidating the market and exploiting some economies of scale that digital economies inherently bring with them. That's network economies or direct or indirect, or whether we're talking about data So there is a trade-off in terms of achieving efficiencies of scale and then balancing and ensuring innovation keeps happening, and in the dynamic sense, competition laws work. So that's the very quick background that I wanted to give. And I first want to bring on Mr. Vipul Puri. Mr. Puri is the Joint Director at the Competition Commission of India. Vipul, thank you very much for taking the time out to be here today. What I wanted to ask you was that, given the Commission's experience in the last few years on some of these issues, why was there a need felt, or is there a need felt to bring about changes in especially in the merger control regime? And in your opinion, do you think that the proposed amendments will help the Commission, do its job better in ensuring fair play in the markets? So thanks, Vipul.
Thank you, Nishant. Thank you, Center for the Digital Future and India Development Foundation. As far as the need of this revision in the notification threshold is concerned, let us first begin by discussing that what kind of regime do we have? We have a mandatory notification regime, but one very important aspect of our regime is that CCI does not have a residuary power. That means if a particular transaction does not meet the thresholds which have been prescribed in the Competition Act, then even if the transaction is likely to cause any appreciable adverse effect on competition in real terms, the CCI is not empowered to look at it. Therefore, it is very important that our thresholds are effective, and there should not be any room for any transaction which has the likelihood of causing any adverse effect on competition to get away. Now, if we see that in this light, our initial thresholds are prescribed in terms of the values of assets and turnover, though there can be a lot of debate in terms of what are the right values. But even if we look at the overall thing, that how good are the thresholds in terms of assets and turnover, I personally feel that the asset thresholds in particular do not add much value when you are looking to examine the combinations, when you are looking to filter out the combinations for considering that whether they should be regulated under the merger regime or not. Turnover has a lot of value because it actually reflects the presence. But again, wherever you will have a sector where the overall market size is so small, then the absolute values of turnover which we have is really going to lead to a situation that such transactions can always escape scrutiny. Now, the possibility of this thing happening is more pertinent in case of new age economy, digital economy, but even in the traditional sectors, this thing cannot be ruled out. There are many industries in which the overall turnover would be very significant, but you have to read this considering the fact that in case of M&As, we consider the relevant assets and relevant turnover. So if a particular combination, let's say in pharma sector, let's move away for a bit from the new economy. If we are looking at a pharma sector and the proposed combination involves acquisition of 2 or 3 leading brands, then even if they have very good presence, the total turnover may be around 500 or 600 crore. That may be making up the market size. Whereas the current thresholds we have will aspire for the combined turnover of 6,000 crore, combined values of assets of 2,000 crore. So reading the two together, one limitation of turnover of being an absolute number, and therefore obviously being limited in certain situations where the overall market size is, coupled with the fact that we are going to consider the relevant assets and relevant turnover, there is a big problem. And that is why this need for revision of thresholds is felt. I think this answers the initial question, and we can then take the things further.
Thanks. Thank you, Vipul. So one thing I think I'll reiterate from what I understood from what you said was that this may not necessarily have to deal with the digital markets entirely, because there may be a need that is felt in other areas as well. Dr. Sridhar, before we go ahead, and it was very well laid out why these changes are important. What I wanted to get a sense from you was that, especially in the technology markets, what is the overall right now? What is the overall economic scenario as you see it in the technology markets in terms of, especially the interplay between startups, maybe between startups and big tech? So the consolidation that I was talking about, if it is there. And sorry, again, my excitement, I forgot to introduce Dr. Sridhar is a professor at IIIT Bangalore. And very fortunately for us, he's also on the Research Advisory Council for the Center for the Digital Future. So Dr. Sridhar, if you could start by addressing that question, I think it will give us a good background as to where we are in terms of the markets themselves.
Thanks, Nishant, and thanks to CDF for inviting me for this particular panel. So I would like to break up this into two aspects. First is, as Mr. Vipul Puri pointed out, most of the digital firms are platform-based. If you look at the startup ecosystem in India, 90% of the startups are platforms, and therefore they are asset light, and they basically work on the network effect, not only the direct network effect, which which everyone knows, but also on the cross-side network effects. For example, buyers and sellers. If one side happens to grow, the other side grows, right? So this is what Tirol in his economic perspectives paper long time back noted. Now, because of this, there are 2 or 3 problems. The asset-based thresholds may not make much sense. The absolute number on both sides, all the different stakeholders in the marketplace, definitely plays a role. Right? So, for example, we have defined significant social media intermediaries as those who cross 5 million. Right? Something like that will definitely matter because these numbers increase the network effect and hence has the potential to grow this particular sector or the particular firm exponentially. Now, having said that, there are 2 kinds of mergers and acquisitions that we are witnessing in the startup market. The one is the horizontal mergers and acquisitions, which happen because of economies of scale reasons, right? So if more and more firms of the same kind get merged together, which has been happening in the edtech sector, for example, quite a bit, there is a lot of synergy, and therefore there is huge economies of scale, unit cost comes down, and therefore the growth is possible. The second one is vertical. But horizontal mergers and acquisitions are easier to set and regulate because there are thresholds which can be set, right? For example, revenue-based, market share or revenue share, things like that, or some of the ways by which horizontal mergers and acquisitions are being regulated worldwide. The second one is vertical mergers and acquisitions. This is the trickiest part, right? So in the vertical mergers and acquisitions, it is not happening because of economies of scale, but it happens because of economies of scope. The scope of offerings by this particular firm as a merged entity encompasses huge number of goods and services, and therefore it has the potential to disrupt the particular market. Now, even FTC has been having a real big problem with defining threshold for vertical mergers and acquisitions. That is something that has been happening in India as well. So these are, for example, killer acquisitions, as has been defined by EU, is really, really bad in terms of vertical mergers and acquisitions, because one startup which has a brilliant idea gets wobbled up because of its IP, intellectual property, and that is not good for that particular startup or new entrants in the marketplace. So these are some things that we need to sort of look at. FTC, for example, basically creates 2 kinds of effects because of mergers and acquisitions: the unilateral effect, the direct effect, and the coordinate effect, the indirect effect. And therefore, we need to come up with some methods by which both horizontal as well as vertical mergers and acquisitions in the digital marketplaces can be evaluated and regulated. So this is my just first glimpse of answer for your question, Nishant. Over.
So thanks very much. So I think, again, I'm just going to quickly say that, again, one thing I think from what you said that emerges is that clearly the existing thresholds may not be enough for the digital economy, maybe given their special nature of the markets, but also that there are efficiencies and growth requirements that necessitate some form of combinations as well. So that is sort of the trade-off that we have to be aware of in the market. Nisha, I have I mean, if you want to answer the earlier questions, of course, please do feel free. However, I would like you to sort of comment on the specific form that the bill as it currently is takes, right? It doesn't really mention any parameters at all in terms of what could be considered alternatively to what we have. And wouldn't it be better or more certain just to have stated specific parameters up front? And if you want to just quickly bring us up to speed, what could these parameters be? What was discussed? What are the potential possibilities here? Nisha. And Nisha, sorry, again, heads the National Competition Law Practice at Trilegal. And thank you very much again, Nisha, to you too for being here. We can't hear you.
Thanks, Nishant. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Thanks. So I agree with what Vipul and Mr. Sridhar have effectively said earlier, right? And what is it that was actually discussed at the CLRC by way of full and fair disclosure? I was part of a working group, right? So we discussed, inter alia, we discussed deal value thresholds, which are also called the transaction size test. This is something that at least 6 major jurisdictions have in the antitrust world. The US has it, Germany has it, Austria has it, Sweden, South Korea, and Canada all have a size of transaction threshold. The US, for instance, it is currently at about $100 million, right? So if you've got a deal size of $100 million, right, that's the first level filter that they will look at it, right? So they're assuming that if you're going to pay $100 million for a transaction, irrespective of what the revenue threshold is, there is something to that business, right? There is something to that business, because what is merger control? Merger control is a counterfactual. You don't just look at a business today, you look at what its tomorrow is going to be, right? What is the future earning potential of that business? Where's that business going to fit into the acquirer's business in terms of overall market structure, market share, right? You're effectively doing a futuristic planning as well as a competition regulator. And given that Vipul said that we do not have, right? And as a practitioner, to me, it is far better that we have these other criteria than that we have a situation like the US or like the EU, where they can look at any transaction, irrespective of any reportable measures, right? So at least for us, there is certainty, because certainty is the cornerstone of any merger control regime, a successful one, right? So we have thresholds today. These are asset and turnover. What is the government looking at doing? The government's looking at introducing other additional criteria. And this criteria is not going to be introduced in absentia, right? The government's going to do it in consultation with the CCI, which today has 12 years of experience on the ground, right? So as a competition regulator, the CCI very much is sector agnostic. So yes, digital economy is one parameter. I can give you a couple of others, right? There's biotech, there's big pharma. If they're acquiring an R&D outfit which will commercialize and have a blockbuster drug 3 years down the line, right? But today it doesn't meet your asset and turnover criteria. That's something you look at. Again, as a practitioner, when you look at these big bang power projects, right? Which we call turnkey, right? As long as that key is not turned, it's extremely asset heavy, but the turnover is 0 on day 1, right? So you could go ahead and you could acquire ports, because you're setting them up, right? And at the end of the day, you assume that, look, there won't be an anti-competition effect. But if you've got other criteria in terms of what you're willing to pay for that transaction, which shows that you see that there's a certain value to it, irrespective of digital economy, right? That's one parameter. The UK and Spain, they also look at a supply of share test, right? Where they basically say, if post this particular transaction, you've got a 25% share of goods or services in the market, that's the second parameter that you can look at. I personally prefer a transaction size test because there is more certainty to it. Because here your 25% will depend on how you cut and dice the market. As industry, we will define it broadly. As the regulator will define it narrowly, right? So there's always bound to be that delta miss. And then it builds in inefficiency into a merger control regime. Other parameters which can be looked at, number of users on a data deal, right? So if we look at Facebook, WhatsApp, for instance, which is what really set the ball rolling in a very big way, when it came to discussing whether competition regulators should be looking at it. The US looked at it, EU looked at it because it hit 3 particular jurisdictions thresholds within the EU metric, right? But most of the other regulators couldn't look at it, given that the revenue was very, very low, although the number of users was very high. right? So it's not necessarily that that deal had anti-competitive effects. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying from a regulator scrutiny perspective, just because a regulator scrutinizes does not mean that the deal has an anti-competitive effect. In fact, the CCI in its slightly over 10 years of merger control review has looked at 913 transactions and not blocked a single one to date. Only 8 of those have gone to a phase 2 review with significant remedies, right? So effectively less than 1% overall have gone to a phase 2, nothing blocked. So just because they're going to look at it, even from a digital economy startups perspective, does not mean that it will automatically create a problem. Will it create an administrative burden to the industry and the regulator? Yes. And that's why I'm hoping that these metrics are significantly high so that the CCI's limited bandwidth is not consumed looking at deals which have no problems in this space.
Thanks, Nisha. Thank you very much. Actually, that's a very good summarization of what is possible. But just to repeat the question that I had in a slightly different way, what is the need to not specify at the moment a criterion upfront? Because as you said, and we can discuss that, I hope we will, but there may be advantages and disadvantages given our own setup. There may be advantages and disadvantages to each of these possibilities. Certainly, share of market is a problem anyway in figuring out in the digital markets. But do you see there's a specific reason why you may want to not address these parameters upfront and keep them open for discussion later?
So if you're looking at, let's just look at digital economy, right? The market, like you rightly mentioned in your introduction, right? The market is dynamic, it's constantly evolving, it's fragmented. If something is prescribed today, it might not necessarily hold good 6 months down the line in these kind of markets, right? So it is better then for the government in consultation with the CCI, and they actually do this when they're doing exemptions and they're doing other notifications, right? They can annually decide and then annually review. Even within our current act, the thresholds that we do have, Nishant, undergo a 2-year review, right? Every 2 years, right, these thresholds are either enhanced, reduced, or kept static. Those are the 3 options that the government has in consultation with the regulator, right? So the same metric can be followed. The US, for instance, annually revises its transaction size test because they say that, look, the M&A market is evolving, the global economy is evolving. Some years are great, so you'll enhance it. Some years are not so good, so then you'll roll it back.
Right. So no, I agree. And sorry, maybe I have a question. I have a follow-up question, but I think I'll come back to that question later. But I want to bring in Gregor. Gregor is an economist. He's also a fellow, non-resident fellow at ICCI. He's a distinguished and well-published economist, and now is also the founder of his own consulting firm, Competition Sphere. Gregor, my question to you is that, in terms of these various possibilities that were mentioned in terms of deal value and other thresholds, as an economist, what do you see the possible economic impacts and the economic rationale for these various thresholds? And then a follow-up question to that is that, do they impact the incentives of players in the market differently, right? Because I think that is something that we have to worry about, that policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. If you change policies, you will impact how people respond to them, how firms respond to them. And so if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, as kind of a preliminary comment, is that we seem to be all very eager and, for good reasons, for many good reasons, to prevent all kinds of monopolizations or, all kinds of creation of market power. Now, obviously, this is, a noble goal to have, but obviously it also, necessarily hampers the incentives of firms to invest. Some monopolization, is necessary, or gaining of market power is necessary for incentives of firms to have to invest in, IP, which is protected by patent, which, is a grant of monopoly power over certain for a certain period of time and over certain assets. And we are generally not afraid of that. Some acquisitions create market power, not because they are horizontal, because you are acquiring rivals, but because you're acquiring assets, complementary assets, which you need to more efficiently serve customers and so on. So we should be careful not to, just as a matter of principle, try to stifle the incentives for firms to acquire market power. That is a driver of competition. Firms do not want to compete. They want to be monopolists. Now, having said that, everything that has been said so far makes a lot of sense. In today's world, the turnover is no longer a sufficient threshold for a merger review in a merger review proceedings. So we do need to have other criteria which allow us to capture, mergers which are potentially harmful because it comes to an acquisition of a direct rival or a potential rival. But in digital economy, the digital economy is not like pharma. In pharma, you can look at the innovation assets, at the programs, at the pipeline of innovation, and you can see whether a firm is a potential and a significant rival in certain segment or not. In digital market, perhaps less so. So we should be careful not to not to read too much into these acquisitions and characterize just everything that happens as as a potential killer acquisition. It's not like that. Some acquisitions are not killer acquisitions; they're complementary acquisitions. They might result in a higher market power, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think we should have some thresholds. These thresholds should be sufficiently low in terms of the acquisition value, should be sufficiently low so that you should capture a good part of the mergers, but not too low. Even if at risk of some monopolization, it should not be too low, because venture capitalists that finance this type of startups, they're extremely sensitive to delays. 150 days review or 100-day review, it can totally turn off a venture capitalist and meaningfully impact their incentives to finance such deals. When they decide on a deal, they wanted to make it happen fast so that they can then channel their money somewhere else. If they have to wait for, and I've done a number of mergers where the owner was a venture capitalist, the thing that they worry most is not even so much the value, but how fast and how certain is the transaction, how quickly it will happen. It's extremely important not to stifle this channel of investment and therefore innovation. And if we do have this in place, then we have to have also in place a fast procedure track. We have to have something, an instrument which allows for simple mergers, which are already, on the face of it, not necessarily anti-competitive or likely not anti-competitive, to go fast. 10 days, 15 days, a decision that should be in place if we go this route. Otherwise, I think we might be stifling incentives necessarily.
Thanks, Greg. I actually had a question that was now asked. So this is, I'm going to start with Shubhashish's question, which is, it goes back to my question to Nisha about stating parameters up front. I'll read the question as is: should the government be involved in deciding on the threshold? Nothing wrong with the CCI revising the threshold as market conditions change, but isn't the government then keeping powers with itself, which perhaps either should be enjoyed by the regulator or by, let's say, the legislature, right? So it's essentially transferring. That's what the intent of my question was. Is that happening? Is the government transferring, executive power to itself when perhaps it should be either with the legislature or with the regulator? So that was the follow-up question. So Nisha, do you want to take that question? And then maybe if Vipul, you have a comment on that.
So should the CCI be coming out with its own thresholds as a practitioner? Definitely yes, right? Because I believe that the CCI today is no longer a new regulator, right? Over a decade old, we're considered to be one of the majors globally, right? Because when you're looking at a transaction today, you're no longer just looking at an India-centric transaction. most transactions globally, right, will definitely have a strong India element, because today India is a very key economy. So therefore, I believe, right, the CCI is well equipped to do this on its own. Perhaps given that it is pending in Parliament at the moment, right, and that the CCI did start out, because competition law in India compared to what the MRTP, its predecessor, was, right, is a very different animal. Maybe the government is using this as a short-cap arrangement, as a check and balance for the moment, and perhaps give it another 3 to 5 years. And I'm pretty sure that the CCI will be running this entirely on its own, where it will come out with its own thresholds, because the CCI has all of the capacity and competence very much to do so. I'd just like to comment on one of Gregor's points, which I thought were absolutely excellent, right? The CCI, to its credit, right, this 150 days is an outer limit, right? So less than 1% of all transactions notified to the CCI to date have hit this outer limit, which is currently 210, and which the government is looking at bringing down to 150, right? But otherwise, typically everything was done within the 30 working days, which even that is being reduced to 20, right? So the framework is such that venture capitalists and normal M&A also, because there's the cost to M&A acquisition financing, will definitely not stand disadvantaged. I'll hand over to Vipul with this.
Yeah, I would say that CCI has already on its part come up with certain regulations wherein certain transactions which are not likely to cause any appreciable adverse effect on competition, those have been already listed, and it has been provided that those transactions are not normally required to be notified to CCI. Similarly, when it comes to the thresholds, I don't see this particular provision that central government in consultation with CCI, because as Nisha has mentioned, that maybe going 3 or 5 years down the line, CCI may have this power and CCI may do it on its own. But as of now, if it's a question that you bring a certain provision and the government comes out with a notification, so it kind of lends more certainty to the overall procedure. Because if there are only the enabling provisions in the Act, then CCI may come out with the thresholds as well. But in absence of those thresholds, it may not be very appropriate to come out through the and provide the thresholds even through the regulations that we are going to issue. So I don't see that as a problem. And in fact, I feel that already sufficient checks and balances are provided in that language itself. The concerns which were being raised that Gregor had mentioned, that there should be a fast track procedure which should complement if such a regime is to come out. Then I would like to say that CCI already introduced a green channel system. A green channel system is where the proposed combination does not involve any horizontal overlaps. In that case, the combination is deemed approved. If there are no horizontal overlaps or no complementary or vertical relationships, then the combination is deemed approved. So, there is no waiting period at all. Similarly, when these criteria are ultimately going to be notified, then again, there will be fresh scope to introduce all the necessary checks and balances. As of now, it's quite an open criteria.
Thanks, Vipul. And the other question, I think, relates to broadly what we have been discussing, but in a very specific way, which is that if I'm rephrasing the question, but if I am a startup, right, and I'm looking to get acquired, suppose that is my exit route, and if I'm not, so we are, if for example an incumbent is acquiring a startup, then it must necessarily be the case that the incumbent is offering the highest value, right? Because otherwise, that's how markets work. So you're offering the highest value, and if we force, because of concerns about competition in the future, right, not right now, because that is, I think, the thing. To me, that is the thing about mergers and acquisitions. It's worry about potential competition in the future, which regulators do have the capacity to deal with. It's just that maybe it's less costly for everybody involved to deal with it upfront. Because that's how I would look at it. You can always deal with something in the future. A combined entity can always be dealt with in the future. But therefore, are we not going to affect the financial, the financial services market in the sense of venture capital and others, if we necessarily close down that route? Now, I don't know the numbers. Dr. Sridhar, if you have actually any idea about how important this channel is for startups to exit in India, how serious should this concern be when we think about these changes?
Definitely, Nishant. In one of the webinar, workshops that we conducted with the digital startups in India, right. Most of the smaller startups want to have the exit option available for them, because in digital economy, the size matters, right? So unless, and even the venture capitalists, apart from the initial seed funding, they look for exponential growth. So which means that cannot happen until the entities become larger and larger, right? It's, I mean, as someone says, it is n square or n power p or something like that, right? The number really matters. And therefore, the startups, which are small, are difficult to break even. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, most of the startups fail, and most of the startups do not make enough, do not at all make any profit, right? So it is very important for them to be provided this exit option. Now, the question is, when do we, take a regulatory measure after this acquisition takes place? So as competition law clearly states, monopolization per se is okay, is not bad, but abuse of monopoly power is to be monitored and regulated. So we need to have an effective mechanism to find out these abuses, the events which happen, which hurt consumer interest and also competition. I mean, those are some things that we need to redefine in the digital economy. That's my opinion.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to comment on this specific question in terms of balancing the, as Dr. Sridhar said, the need perhaps by a lot of startups, rightly or wrongly, but that's not in our hands, it's a market. Yes, Vipul.
I would like to make a point.
Yes.
The current discussions we are having, firstly, they are on the aspect of notification. It's a notification criteria, so there is nothing on the review side, on the assessment side. Right. So, all of that is going to follow. The thing is that, firstly, we are trying to introduce a new criteria, and we already have sufficient safeguards in place. Here, I would like to mention a very important exemption, which is already a part of our merger review. And the CLRC has also included that, and recommended that it should be made part of the Act itself. And that is the de minimis exemption. We have a provision that if the value of assets or the turnover, value of the assets which are being acquired is less than rupees 350 crores, or the value of turnover, which can be attributed to that particular business which is being acquired, is less than rupees 1,000 crores, then such a transaction is not required to be notified. So those thresholds still stand as of now, even in the scheme of things. Now, how this particular new provision, when it's going to come up, in fact, I would say that we will need to take a call on the de minimis exemption also, because otherwise the actual situation may be that on one hand you introduce a new criteria and the de minimis continues to
give exemption,
apply the same situation as we have now. So one safeguard which we should appreciate is this. Then, even if the transaction is considered as notified, it has breached the de minimis thresholds, it has met the new criteria which will be introduced. Even then, as Nisha had pointed out, that in the 10 or 11 years history of the competition law enforcement, around 8 cases have gone to phase 2 investigation. So, that should give some sort of confidence to the startup community that their concerns, maybe on account of valuation, etc., will also be considered during the review. So the point is that if we do not have any of such provision, then basically we are letting go of all the cases. Whereas if we have this provision, then by just having this provision, it doesn't imply that there is going to be any harm to the innovation or their incentives to have a startup the particular way, or to even exit if they want.
Thanks, you. So I have about this. Raise this again in terms of what kind of parameters do we choose. So I just wanted to bring this up that personally, I agree with the fact that the digital economy is obviously different. I think we all agree to that the digital economy is different, and perhaps if we use the same criterion, we are going to miss some things that we, some deals that we think are probably potentially harmful. Although I have a concern in the sense that we actually at the moment are also discussing what constitutes abuse of dominance in digital economies. So if that is not clear, then taking a step back and saying that what can potentially cause dominance is, I think, an even more difficult question. So it's not an easy question to answer. So I completely do understand that. But in terms of deal value thresholds, my sort of worry and my question is therefore that deal value thresholds are manipulable, right? Because they're not market discovered. Revenue and asset prices are functions of market prices to very complicated form, but they are functions of market prices. Deal values are not. So they can be manipulated, right? You can have creatively structured deals. So how much of a problem that is, and again, I think Nisha did bring it up, and I wanted to discuss that point, that wouldn't it be better to not have deal value thresholds, but what if some residuary powers, for example, were to be left with the commission? So sorry, that's my question. If somebody wants to, Nishant, if you want to start with that, and then I'll bring the others in a second. Yeah.
So the residuary powers, right, from an industry perspective and a practitioner's perspective, are far more problematic because there's then never any certainty. Right, you can never sign off saying that this transaction the CCI is not going to scrutinize ever. Right, you could be de minimis. Right, even then what have you done? You've gone back literally into the dark ages because you've taken away even our de minimis exemption. Right, basically the regulator has the ability to look at anything and everything. That's why these additional criteria, I'm absolutely with you on this, Nishant. They need to be objective. They need to be out there, right? Whether they come out by way of a guidance note, whether they come out by way of an annual notification, I don't have a preference, or whether they're codified in the act, right? I'm agnostic to it. But wherever they are, they need to be very clear-cut, objective, and uniformly applied. And they can be uniformly applied within a class, right? So for instance, we could have digital economy, which is different from pharma, which is different from power projects, right? So you could have that. Now, in terms of transaction size, it's not new. The US has had it for a very long time, right? Germany brought about in 2017, and then they've had 3 rounds of consultation since. What is it that can happen? Well, most of these deals, the deal value is in public domain. Even in the course of a normal merger review, I am expected and required by law to give the CCI my transaction documents, which will give them the deal value. The CCI has the ability to ask me for the valuation report, so I can't mess with it. But where the CCI will actually have to come out with guidance is not all deal value is a cash transaction. We could have a share swap, right? Where basically I'm acquiring this innovative disruptor, and in turn, right, the target's founders, right, they get like a 5% stake in me, and I'm the acquirer, right? So you could have that kind of a share swap. You could have a part cash, part share deal. You could have that. You could also have a situation where you say, okay, we would like the founders of the target to continue with us for the next 5 years, right, to integrate the business. So you could have different constructs on it. And obviously, each of this is going to have to be addressed by way of guidance notes and regulations. There's no other way around it. So you're absolutely right. There is a lot of scope for creative structuring around this. But like I said, it's not new in the competition world. It's been out there. The CCI will have enough ready-made precedent. And the CCI today has a whole network of MOUs, which they've signed across the globe with other competition regulators, including the 6 I've mentioned. So they could very easily, with a phone call, reach out and get the requisite information.
Right. Thanks, Nisha. So, Gregor, given your experience in a different jurisdiction, and I mean, what are your thoughts on, for example, you did mention the deal value thresholds may be better than revenue thresholds. So both in terms of sort of fleshing out that difference, and also in terms of, do you have any, so for example, is there any evidence on how these deal value thresholds are working in the jurisdictions, let's say in Europe?
Yeah. So, there was a recent acquisition of Kifi by Facebook. I think this is still an ongoing debate. I'm not sure it was concluded. I actually did a bit of work on that as well, so I can't comment too much. But there it definitely kicked in because Kifi did not have much of much of in terms of revenue. They produce these GIFs that you can then share and so on. So that's where it kicked in. And I think for good reasons, these things have to be looked at. In Germany, for example, they have a combination of this different thresholds. So they have I believe 400 million deal value threshold. One of the companies must have at least 25 million in terms of revenue. And then there's also importance of the local nexus, which is something which we didn't discuss, but this is also something that I imagine the Indian competition authority has in mind, because if you don't have this local nexus, then you have an issue with international law and jurisdictional problems and so on. So this is another thing. But I think that these thresholds usually are set, at least in our jurisdiction, sufficiently high that you do not capture too much. And then if things are obviously not problematic, you go on some kind of a fast track procedure, and that is not such an issue though. However, I think we should prevent the urge to try to completely, we should fight the urge to prevent all and every kind of risk of the creation of monopoly. Obviously, I'm not talking about horizontal mergers taking place, which are clearly anti-competitive. But we should not try with ex-ante regulation to prevent every instance of potential monopolization of the market, because that will definitely slow the economy, the innovation process, and ultimately competition. As platforms compete by, as Dr. Sridhar explained, they compete by kind of creating a monopoly, by generating network effects, nurturing network effects, the positive ones, and then growing to the extent when they cover very significant part of the market. And that's a dynamic process where then ultimately they get displaced and so on. And that's every entrepreneur, they do not want to compete. They want to be monopolists, and that's what drives them. So we should not try to, nip that bud or that innovative drive at all costs. We should be relaxed about some things, sometimes, getting under the radar and, saying, okay, we should have looked at that. We couldn't have known. Fine, we'll deal with it with antitrust, with, not with merger control.
Thanks. Actually, thanks for bringing up what I was going to discuss next very briefly, but given the time. So Gregor, you did talk about local nexus, and I think maybe in the, since we are talking about the digital economy and given its very nature, borders may not be that important for definitely for our firms in this business.
Nishant, I would just like to respond
please.
On the local nexus point.
Yes,
the
please.
De minimis exemption, as the way it stands today, is in fact a very strong local nexus requirement in itself, because it requires the parties to have a certain minimum turnover and a certain minimum asset base in India. Only then the transaction is considered as notifiable. So that is one which is an overriding local nexus requirement applicable to all the notification thresholds we have. And I'm pretty sure that this requirement will obviously be in the minds when the ultimate the criteria will be decided in accordance with the new requirement.
Right. Thanks. So actually, I was coming to that, and I was, I guess my question was, which I think you already answered. My question was that the review committee did mention local nexus, but does it find appropriate place in the amendment bill as we have it currently? So I think Vipul, what you're saying is that there is a local sort of revenue or turnover requirement. So again, I think it points to the fact that you may need a combination of thresholds to arrive at, which interact with each other to arrive at the exact understanding of what this will be. So Vipul, since you mentioned this, and I think one of the questions I did want to ask you is that a lot of this has the potential, and again, depending on how we set the thresholds and the rules, but it has the potential of essentially increasing the work of the CCI. Right? And so do you see sort of any implementation challenges? Or, I mean, do you think that there are complementary changes required in the regulator itself to deal with some of these issues? And also, of course, because the time to decision is critical, as we've discussed.
Yeah, actually, I had made one point earlier that the CCI has already introduced a green channel system. So now, suppose this particular provision is introduced, and thereafter, we start getting a certain startup notification, startup combination also fulfilling the criteria. The green channel system which we have as of today is based on the fact that either there shouldn't be any overlap, horizontal, vertical, complementary, nothing. But that system is fully capable of being modified and aligned to the new requirements. So on one side, if we introduce a new requirement and we feel that it is likely to become over intrusive, or again, because our focus is to catch only the exceptional transactions, not all the transactions. So if the need so arises, then there are enough safeguards, enough checks and balances in the overall regulatory structure, which can be used to assuage these type of concerns of the startups. So if you look at the overall scheme of things, yes, there are other provisions, and these issues can be easily handled with that.
Thanks. Nisha, do you wanted to comment on?
So I don't think the intention is to catch all startups, right? And I wouldn't say it is to catch the unicorns, because the unicorns are already undergoing scrutiny. They've hit those thresholds. So for instance, Temasek invested in Ola. It was a fairly simplistic merger review. SoftBank invested in Paytm in terms of a follow-up, not in its initial rounds, right? With a 65% share in the M-wallet space. This is public domain, right? The CCI cleared it unconditionally, right? In recognition of the fact that these are competitive markets, there's ease of entry, right? It's a very dynamic, evolving market, constantly, coming to Gregor's point, right? And to Sridhar's, that at the end of the day, the CCI is not just looking at market share as a static number, right? They're also looking at contestable markets. Will there continue to be innovation and the like, right? So what is the real idea behind this? It is effectively to look at those one-off transactions, right? Where the regulator couldn't look at it because the turnover itself was not established, right? Again, I come back to a Facebook, WhatsApp as an example in the Indian context, right? Or a Snapdeal free charge in the Indian context, or a Zomato Uber Eats in the Indian context, which the regulator couldn't scrutinize under merger control, right? Or literally, Nishant, the pre-round just before it becomes a unicorn. So it's not going to affect the entire startup culture. Definitely not, because if that were true, right, forget the CCI, right? The CCI would need an office in every city in the country, because there would be no other way around it, right? Because if we're looking at 11-year-old regime where you've had effectively 913 notifiable transactions, you definitely cannot be looking at the startup ecosystem.
Right. No, thanks. See, one of the, obviously, we are kind of coming to the end of this discussion, the allotted time. I think where sort of my doubts lie, and where I see from this discussion what is that it's not in the like always, the devil really does lie in the detail, because it depends exactly on where you will put the threshold. I think it might make for a fantastic empirical study once these things happen and once these changes are there. But I do agree that certainly cannot deny the need to arm the regulators with more teeth as things change, but perhaps respecting the market forces also. So we have about 5 minutes, and let's. If you have any parting comments or thoughts on the whole discussion. So let's go back in the reverse order. So Gregor, let me start with you first.
Yeah, so, I was thinking about this green system, which I think is a really good instrument, and it should be, I think, in the view of what we're discussing now, actually expanded, because most mergers that will happen in this context and will now be captured, but before they will be in some way complementary or vertical. And you should try to, in my view, figure out how some of those could actually also fit into that fast track procedure, because that is so important for the investors to get through fast. that's my sort of parting comment.
Thanks. Nisha?
Light touch regulation when it comes to the startup ecosystem, because it's very important, right, that innovation is not killed, particularly where we are as a nation today. And what we're looking at in terms of the spread and the fact that we want India champions, we want people to be able to scale up. And you want them to scale up not just in India, you want them to scale up globally, right? So if they have to compete with the vastly funded conglomerates elsewhere, you need to let them grow, right? So initially, at least light touch, certainty with light touch.
Thanks. Professor Sridhar?
So ex-ante regulation with flexible multi-parameter measures. Ex post only take exceptional circumstances and then deal with that. So that is my view.
Thanks. And Vipul, if you have any parting comments on that.
I would just like to reiterate that the existing overall merger regulation scheme, is required to be seen in that perspective. That the CCI over a period of time has already worked on a particular philosophy, and the green channel system, etc., which has been introduced, are a testimony to that fact. Similarly, the provisions which will be issued pursuant to the new provisions which are on the recommendations of CLRC will also be on the same lines. They will also contain they will also sort of address the concerns, balance out everything, and basically try to capture only the transaction by exception. Thank you.
Thanks. So thank you all to the panelists, and it's certainly been a very interesting discussion, enlightening to me for sure. So, I mean, if I just to reiterate, I think what Nisha was saying, that and what I do believe, that this is the digital economy is very different. There certainly are economies of scope and economies of scale that you can't, and then those bring in efficiencies, right? And a lot of the times, acquisitions actually are essentially human capital, right? What you are acquiring is, it won't have a patent, but it will be an idea. And those are important, because I think that not everybody has the capacity. Not all entrepreneurs have the capacity or the desire to build a Facebook or a Google or a Uber or Byju's. They are trying to, in some sense, maximize the value of the idea they have, and we should allow, as much as possible, we need to allow all kinds of avenues for that maximization if we are to encourage, innovative activity. And so I do hope that, I think once these things are clearer, we are able to come up with guidance and rules that, as all of you said, bring in more certainty and are only capturing transactions by exception rather than as a matter of rule. So thank you all very much for being here today. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. We will try, and as I said, I was quite serious about it. I think we will try and ICCI follow up and see if we can do some sort of an empirical work around this, shed some light and some evidence on this. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Nisha.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.